Welcome to our Wild West story. Where are you watching from? State in comment and please subscribe. Let's dive in. The dust of Redemption Gulch clung to Sheriff Caylen Stone like a second skin, each grain a silent testament to the relentless sun and the hard life it fostered. The midday heat shimmered off the false fronts of the saloon and the general store, blurring the edges of a town perpetually caught between the promise of prosperity and the ever-present threat of the untamed West. Inside the dimly lit sheriff's office, the only sound was the rhythmic tick of the grandfather clock in the corner, each second a stark reminder of the time that had passed since the life was brutally stolen from his younger brother, Ethan. That loss, a gaping wound that refused to heal, had forged Caylen into the unwavering lawman he was today, a man whose gaze held the cold steel of justice and the lingering sorrow of a past he could never truly escape. A frantic shout from outside shattered the oppressive silence. A breathless stagecoach driver, his face streaked with sweat and grime, burst through the door. "Sheriff! The Blackwoods!" They hit the stage 20 miles east, cleanin' out the strongbox and they shot poor Jedediah. The name hung in the air, heavy with the familiar dread the Blackwood gang inspired. Notorious for their ruthless efficiency and their uncanny ability to evade capture, the Blackwoods were a festering sore on the landscape, their exploits growing bolder with each passing robbery. A muscle tightened in Caylen's jaw. The memory of Ethan, his bright smile extinguished too soon, flared in his mind. This time, he vowed, it would be different. This time, the echoes of Iron Creek, where his brother had fallen victim to a petty claim dispute turned deadly, would finally find some semblance of peace. He reached for his worn leather duster, the weight of his Colt Peacemaker a familiar comfort against his hip. "Saddle my horse," he commanded, his voice low and gravelly, the promise of retribution hardening his gaze. As he stepped out into the blinding sunlight, the townsfolk parting respectfully before him, Caylen Stone, the haunted sheriff of Redemption Gulch, set out into the vast and unforgiving Wild West, the ghosts of the past riding with him, and the burning desire for justice his only guide. Caylen Stone rode east, the sun a relentless forge at his back, burning off the last remnants of the morning chill. The trail was faint, almost swallowed by the wind-scoured plains, but his tracker's eyes, honed by years of grim pursuit, found the subtle signs: a displaced stone, a snapped twig, a horseshoe print with a distinctive nick in its heel. The Blackwood gang was not as clever as they thought. His journey was solitary, save for the ghost of his brother, Ethan, that rode silently beside him, a constant, nagging presence that fueled his resolve. The vast, open landscape, with its endless stretches of sagebrush and distant, hazy mesas, offered a deceptive sense of peace. Yet, Caylen knew that beneath the serene surface, the West was a place of brutal truths and sudden violence. His destination, a remote canyon known as Shadow Creek, was said to be the gang's elusive lair, a place whispered about in dusty saloons with a mix of fear and awe. He reached a small, forgotten trading post and dismounted, the old boards of the porch groaning under his weight. A lone, grizzled prospector sat hunched over a cup of black coffee, his eyes sunken and weary. Caylen's presence seemed to awaken him, and a knowing look passed between them. "You're chasin' shadows, Sheriff," the old man rasped, not bothering to look up. "That canyon swallows up fools and men who ain't wise to its ways." The prospector then spoke of the Blackwood gang's leader, a man known only as Blackwood, a cunning figure who commanded a fierce loyalty from his crew. The old man spoke of their uncanny ability to disappear into the very earth, leaving no trace. He pointed a trembling, dirt-caked finger toward the north. "Last I heard, they was headed for Shadow Creek. But that ain't no place for a lone lawman. The canyon has eyes, and the wind whispers their names." A sudden fierce gust of wind rattled the shack's windows as if on cue, the low, mournful sound a dire warning. Caylen's resolve, however, was forged in grief and hardened by duty. He paid for his water, tipped his hat, and rode off, the old prospector's words echoing in his mind. As the first drops of a gathering storm began to spatter the ground, Caylen saw the dark maw of Shadow Creek Canyon looming on the horizon. The sky above it was a bruised purple, and a sense of foreboding, cold and sharp as a knife, settled deep in his gut. The storm broke with a fury as Caylen entered the canyon's embrace. The first crack of thunder sounded like a cannon shot, and the rain, heavy and cold, began to fall in sheets, turning the winding trails into treacherous ribbons of mud. The towering rock formations, dark and imposing, seemed to close in around him, creating a maze of shadows and echoes. He dismounted and led his horse, his eyes constantly scanning the alcoves and ledges above for any sign of a hidden lookout. The air was thick with the scent of wet stone and sage, and the sound of the storm was a deafening roar that swallowed all other noise. Kalen was a man accustomed to solitude, but the canyon's deep, claustrophobic silence between the thunderclaps was different. It felt watched, a stillness that held a promise of violence. He continued his careful search, and soon the subtle signs he'd been tracking became more frequent and distinct. He found a discarded tin can, still gleaming from the rain, and a fresh boot print in the mud that matched the one from the stagecoach robbery. This wasn't just a trail, it was a fresh scent. He found a small, sheltered overhang and paused, giving his horse a brief rest while he studied the terrain. The storm had begun to subside, the rain lessening to a gentle drizzle, and the air grew still and quiet once more. It was then, in that profound stillness, that a sound, thin and clear, drifted on the newly washed air. It was a melody played on a harmonica, a haunting and melancholy tune that spoke of lonely nights and lives spent on the run. The sound seemed to come from deeper within the canyon, a direct invitation, a siren's song to a hunter. He knew he was close now. The song ended abruptly, and Kalen, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol, took a deep breath. His heart beat a steady rhythm against his ribs, a drumbeat of anticipation. He cautiously moved forward, following the source of the sound, knowing that the hunter might be about to become the prey. The sky, a canvas of deep indigo, held the promise of a new day, but down in the canyon, the pre-dawn stillness felt heavy and cold. The last of the storm's moisture had settled, leaving a damp chill in the air that seemed to cut to the bone. Kalen Stone had found the camp, nestled in a wide, bowl-like clearing, hidden from the world above. He lay prone on a ridge overlooking the sight, his senses on high alert, his gaze sweeping over the bedrolls and scattered gear. A faint column of smoke curled from a dying fire, and the occasional snore or cough was the only sound. He counted 4 figures, all sleeping soundly, their rifles stacked nearby. This was it. The moment he had been chasing for weeks. The finality of it all settled over him, a calm, cold certainty that this journey, fueled by the memory of his brother's smile, was about to end in either justice or a shallow grave. He slipped his Colt Peacemaker from its holster, its familiar weight a grim comfort in his hand, and began his silent descent, moving like a phantom among the shadows and jagged rocks. He was a mere 10 yards from the camp when a sudden, jarring noise shattered the stillness. One of the figures stirred, sitting up with a tired grunt. A faint splash of morning light caught the glint of a rifle barrel. He was seen. "Get up! We got company!" the man yelled, his voice raw with sleep-deprived panic. The canyon, which had been so silent just moments before, erupted in a chorus of shouts and gunfire. Kalen instinctively dropped to the dirt, the shots zinging past his head as he returned fire with a practiced, lethal efficiency. The roar of his own pistol was deafening in the confined space, the echoes bouncing off the canyon walls in a chaotic symphony of violence. He used the cover of the rocks and the blinding flashes of gunfire to his advantage, targeting one man after another, his focus unwavering. The fight was a brutal, chaotic blur of smoke and sound, a dance with death he had performed too many times before. He fought with a singular purpose, fueled by the burning image of a boy he had failed to protect. He managed to drop 2 of the outlaws, and the third scrambled for his weapon in a panic. Kalen cornered him against the canyon wall, his pistol aimed true. The man, his face a mask of terror, fumbled for his weapon, but Kalen's voice, a low rumble of authority, stopped him cold. "Drop it. Now." The outlaw, defeated, let his rifle clatter to the ground. Just as Kalen moved to secure him, a 4th figure emerged from the darkest part of the campsite, not with a pistol, but with a hunting knife clutched in their hand. This one was smaller, faster, moving with a desperate ferocity that caught Kalen off guard. He sidestepped a wild lunge, knocking the knife from their grasp and forcing the figure to the ground. The final outlaw lay defeated, but as Kalen drew close, A lock of red hair fell across their face, and he saw, with a jolt of shock that froze the blood in his veins, that the last member of the Blackwood gang was not a man at all. He had found his quarry, but it was nothing like he had expected. The cold shock of recognition settled over Kaylin. This wasn't a grizzled outlaw, it was a slip of a girl, no older than 20. Her fiery red hair, now matted with dirt and rain, was a stark contrast to her face, streaked with grime but still possessing a fierce, defiant beauty. He knelt beside her, his pistol still in his hand, a sense of grim disbelief washing over him. Her eyes, the color of a stormy sea, were locked on his, filled with a mixture of fear and pure hatred. She didn't struggle as he secured her hands with a length of rope, her body tense and rigid with unyielding fury. "They'll come for you," she spat, her voice a low, venomous whisper. "And you'll wish you died in this canyon." Kaylin ignored the threat, his mind reeling. The Blackwood gang, a name synonymous with ruthless malevolence, had a girl as its youngest member, and she was every bit as defiant as her reputation suggested. He rose, pulling her to her feet, and as he did, a small, intricately carved wooden bird fell from her hand, landing with a soft thud in the mud. He stooped to pick it up, its smooth, polished surface a strange, fragile contrast to the violence of the morning. He tied her to a thick juniper tree to wait for the morning light, her stormy eyes never leaving his face. She remained silent, a fortress of sullen defiance. Kaylin knew he was facing a different kind of challenge now. He was a lawman who dealt in absolutes, good and evil, right and wrong. But this woman, this girl, did not fit into his world of black and white. Her loyalty to her family was clear in her gaze, a fierce, unwavering devotion that he, in his own way, understood. He found a small flask of water and offered it to her, but she turned her head, refusing his gesture. "I'm not thirsty," she said, her voice cracking slightly. The mask of her defiance was slipping, revealing a hint of vulnerability he hadn't expected. The sun began to creep over the canyon's rim, casting a golden light that washed over the scene of the previous night's violence. As he prepared to leave, a final, chilling whisper from her stopped him cold. "You won't get far, Sheriff. My father will find you, and he will make you regret the day you ever set foot in the West." A shiver ran down Kaylin's spine. He had captured her, but the hunt, he realized, was far from over. The morning sun, now high above the canyon walls, turned the dusty trail into a ribbon of gold, but the path ahead for Sheriff Kaylin Stone was anything but clear. He led his horse, with Alara Blackwood riding reluctantly in front of him, her hands tied securely. The silence between them was thick with animosity, each mile a physical representation of the chasm that separated them. Alara remained a fortress of sullen defiance, her head held high despite her captured state. She refused to speak beyond a few clipped, resentful words, testing Kaylin's patience at every turn. He found himself studying her profile, the sharp line of her jaw, the grim set of her mouth, and saw not a criminal, but a reflection of the same fierce loyalty he held for his own lost family. It was a disturbing thought, one that he fought to push from his mind. His duty was simple: deliver the prisoner to the jail in Redemption Gulch. The complexities of her humanity, of her youth and unwavering devotion to her gang, were an unwelcome distraction. He had a job to do, and nothing would get in the way of justice. Their journey was interrupted by the sight of 3 men on horseback blocking the trail ahead, their faces hidden by grimy bandanas. They were scavengers, opportunists who preyed on solitary travelers. The leader, a wiry man with a cruel glint in his eye, held up a rusted pistol. "Looks like we've got a sheriff on a joyride," he sneered. "And a pretty little bird to boot. We'll be taking both of you." A tense standoff ensued. Kaylin reached for his pistol, but the bandits had him at a disadvantage. It was then that Alara's voice, surprisingly calm and low, cut through the tension. "He's just the bait, you fools. The rest of the posse is just over that ridge, waiting to ambush you." The bandit leader hesitated, his eyes darting toward the distant horizon. Alara's words, delivered with chilling conviction, were enough to make them second-guess their plan. With a final, frustrated curse, they turned their horses and rode away, vanishing as quickly as they had appeared. Kaylin looked at Alara, a question in his eyes. She met his gaze, a hint of a defiant smirk on her lips. "I'm worth more alive," she stated simply, "than a pile of dirt in this valley." That night, as they made camp under a blanket of stars, the earlier standoff lingered in the air. Ilara, her fire dampened by exhaustion, sat with her back against a rock, her arms still bound. Kalen built a small fire and tended to his horse. The silence was less hostile now, replaced by a cautious truce. As Kalen wrapped his blanket around him, Ilara spoke, her voice barely a whisper against the crackle of the flames. "Your brother," she began, and Kalen's heart instantly went cold. "Ethan. I remember my pa talking about him. Said he was a good man." "Funny." Kalen froze, his guard instantly up. He didn't deserve what he got. Nobody knew how it really went down, not even the law. They got the wrong man, you know. He wasn't shot in a fair fight. He was run down, trapped. And then. She trailed off, a faraway look in her eyes. Kalen's mind raced. Everything he knew, everything he had been told, was that his brother was shot in the street, an unfortunate victim of a mining dispute. The official story. But Ilara's fragmented account was different, unsettlingly so. A chill that had nothing to do with the night air ran down his spine. The man who had been convicted was locked up for a murder that, if Ilara was to be believed, had happened very differently. This wasn't a trick. The haunted look in her eyes was genuine. For the first time, a seed of doubt was planted in Kalen's heart. He was beginning to realize that the path to justice was far more complex than he had ever imagined, and that the woman in front of him might hold the key to a past he didn't truly know. The morning air was thick with unease. Kalen rode in a state of quiet turmoil, the words Ilara had spoken about his brother running on an endless loop in his mind. He tried to dismiss them as a clever ploy, a desperate attempt by a young outlaw to sow discord and make an escape. But a dark, nagging suspicion had taken root in his heart, a weed that threatened to choke out the rigid certainty he had held for so long. He had found closure in the conviction of the man he believed killed Ethan. It was a cold, hard truth he had used to justify his life as a lawman. The idea that this truth might be a lie, a carefully constructed illusion, was more terrifying than any gunfight. He glanced at Ilara, her head bowed in quiet exhaustion, and felt a strange mixture of animosity and morbid curiosity. The silence between them was no longer empty, it was filled with the ghosts of a past Kalen no longer recognized. He was beginning to realize that bringing her to justice was not just about closing a chapter, but perhaps about tearing the book open. They passed through a small, nameless settlement where a traveling preacher held a service under a tattered tent. The preacher's voice, resonant and full of a fiery conviction, carried across the dusty ground. "The truth," he preached, "is not always what you see with your own two eyes. It is found in the dark, forgotten places of the heart, in the quiet corners of your memory. And a man who judges others without seeking that truth, well, he is no better than a thief in the night." The words were a bitter salve for Kalen's soul, hitting far too close to home. He avoided the preacher's direct gaze, but the message had already been delivered. He had spent years in pursuit of a justice that was clean and simple, but the West, he was learning, was a land of moral ambiguity, where even a righteous man could be standing on the wrong side of a terrible secret. Just as the thought was taking hold, a sound, a distinct and unmistakable clicking, sliced through the air. Kalen's instincts, sharp and honed by a life of danger, screamed at him. 3 riders emerged from a dusty arroyo, rifles drawn, their faces masked. It was a small, desperate faction of the Blackwood gang, a rescue party. "Let her go, Sheriff, and you can ride on," one of them yelled, his voice laced with a reckless desperation. Kalen instinctively drew his pistol, but the outlaws had the drop on them. A shot rang out, not aimed at Kalen, but at Ilara's horse. The animal screamed, its legs buckling, throwing Ilara hard to the ground. A second shot followed, and Kalen felt a searing pain across his shoulder. He fell to his knees, his gun hand momentarily useless. The outlaws began to close in. In a moment of pure, unthinking instinct, Kalen threw himself over Ilara's fallen body, shielding her from the hail of bullets. He was a sheriff, a man of the law, and she was his prisoner. But in that moment, all that mattered was protecting her. The lines between captor and protector were gone. The frantic gunshots faded into the vast, unforgiving silence of the desert. The last of the attackers vanished into the arroyo, leaving Kalen and Alara alone in the aftermath. Kalen, his shoulder throbbing from the bullet graze, pushed himself up and immediately knelt beside Alara, whose face was pale with pain. The bullet hadn't hit her, but her ankle was twisted at an unnatural angle from the fall. He felt a wave of cold, professional detachment as he examined the injury, a well-practiced calm taking over. Yet, beneath it, a current of emotion he couldn't name ran hot and fast, a desperate need to ensure she was all right. He carefully cut away her boot and a piece of his shirt, fashioning a makeshift bandage to stabilize her ankle. It was a strange, silent intimacy born of shared violence. She winced, but didn't cry out, watching him with those stormy eyes, a mix of shock and confusion replacing her usual defiant glare. For the first time, she saw him not as an enemy, but as a man who had instinctively placed himself in harm's way to protect her. "Why?" she asked, her voice a strained whisper, breaking the heavy silence between them. "Why did you do that?" Kalen didn't have an answer that made sense. "I'm a lawman," was all he could manage, a poor excuse for a gut reaction. He poured water onto her wound, cleaning the dirt and grime, and she flinched but otherwise remained still. It was then, in that moment of forced vulnerability, that she began to talk. She spoke of her family not as the cold-blooded gang Kalen had always imagined, but as a collection of misfits and broken men bound by blood and loyalty. She talked about the Blackwood's hard life, living on the fringes, and how the gang was all she had ever known. She spoke of her father not as a ruthless leader, but as a man who had been pushed into a life of crime by a series of betrayals, his heart hardened by a world that had shown him no quarter. Kalen listened, the black and white lines of his world blurring into shades of gray. He saw her loyalty not as a mark of her criminality, but as a testament to her character. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in fiery streaks of orange and purple, Kalen helped Alara to her feet, supporting her as they limped toward a more defensible spot for the night. The silence between them had transformed, replaced by a fragile, unspoken truce. They were no longer captor and captive, but two wounded souls in a vast, dangerous land. Kalen felt a reluctant kinship forming, a connection to her that was as undeniable as it was illogical. But before he could process this profound shift, the sound of hoofbeats echoed from a ridge. The silhouettes of a posse, distinct against the last rays of light, appeared on the horizon. Kalen's hand went for his pistol, but the leader, a stern man with a U.S. Marshal's badge glinting on his vest, raised a hand. "Hold it right there," he yelled, his voice carrying on the wind. "We've been hunting the Blackwood gang for weeks. Looks like we've finally found him. The lot of you are under arrest." A cold wave of dread washed over Kalen. In the eyes of the law, he was no longer a sheriff in pursuit of justice. He was just another outlaw, caught in the company of his prisoner. The U.S. Marshal, a grim-faced man with a jaw set like granite, wasn't interested in Kalen's badge or his protestations of being a lawman. His eyes, hard and cold, took in Kalen's blood-soaked shoulder and his close proximity to the notorious outlaw's daughter. To him, the evidence was clear. "A sheriff, you say?" The marshal scoffed, a cruel smirk on his face. "Funny how many lawmen end up ridin' with outlaws in this territory. Looks to me like you took a turn for the worse." Kalen, his frustration a burning fire beneath his calm exterior, tried to explain the ambush, but the marshal simply tied his hands and threw him in a makeshift stockade alongside Alara. She, in a stunning display of loyalty, spoke up, her voice ringing with clear conviction. "He's telling the truth. He saved my life from my own kind." The posse looked at her in disbelief, a low murmur of confused chatter rippling through the group. The marshal just laughed, a humorless, dry sound. "A true love story," he sneered. "But we'll sort all this out back at the fort." Their captivity was a tense affair. The posse, a rough collection of bounty hunters and local deputies, eyed Kalen with open suspicion and Alara with leering contempt. Kalen tried to keep a low profile, saving his strength for an opportunity he knew would come. He and Elara were pressed close together in the small wooden cage, and a heavy silence settled between them, no longer hostile, but filled with a quiet solidarity. Elara leaned her head against the rough wood, her gaze distant. "They're gonna hang you, you know," she whispered. "My father's men will make sure of it." Kalen's focus was on the fire, on the shifting shadows, on the layout of the camp. "They'll have to find me first," he replied. For the first time since their journey began, she smiled, a small, genuine curve of her lips that lit up her weary face. "You're a stubborn one, Sheriff." In that moment, a bond was forged between them that went beyond their circumstances, a shared understanding of the West's unforgiving nature and the unexpected alliances it could forge. Just as the moon rose high over the canyon, a frantic shout shattered the quiet of the night. Sparks from the campfire, caught by a sudden gust of wind, had ignited a dry pile of brush near the supply wagon. Within moments, the blaze roared to life, a hungry beast devouring everything in its path. Fire! Fire! The camp erupted in chaos. Men screamed, horses neighed, and the air filled with the acrid smell of smoke and burning wood. Kalen saw his chance. Using the chaos as cover, he strained against the rusty lock of the stockade, a desperate, final effort. The lock gave way with a small but triumphant snap, and he and Elara slipped out into the thick, smoke-filled night. With the posse consumed by the fire, they made a mad dash for the nearest horses, cutting the ropes and leaping onto their backs. They rode out of the camp, leaving the pandemonium behind, but as they crested a low ridge and looked back at the flaming inferno, the grim reality hit them both. They were free, but they were no longer a lawman and his prisoner. They were simply two fugitives, alone in the vast, unforgiving desert, with no friends and a price on both their heads. They rode under the cover of darkness, the only sounds the rhythmic thud of hooves on the parched earth and the strained breathing of their horses. The fire from the posse's camp was a distant, angry glow on the horizon, a constant reminder of the life they had just left behind. Kalen's shoulder throbbed with a dull, persistent pain, but it was nothing compared to the cold weight of his new reality. He was a fugitive, a man wanted by the very law he had sworn to uphold. Elara, her face a pale blur in the moonlight, rode beside him, her leg bandaged but still a source of pain. They were two outcasts now, hunted by both sides of the law, with nothing but the clothes on their backs and a fragile, unspoken trust between them. The vast, empty desert was their only sanctuary, its sprawling silence both a comfort and a terrifying reflection of their isolation. As the sun rose, a merciless golden orb in a cloudless sky, the true desperation of their situation set in. The heat was a tangible force, a suffocating blanket that drained their strength with every passing hour. Their meager water supply was running low, and the landscape offered no respite, only endless miles of sun-bleached rock and thorny brush. Kalen, for all his years as a lawman, was a stranger to this kind of primal survival. His skills lay in tracking men, not in finding water in a land that held none. But Elara, born to this life of hardship, was a different kind of guide. Her eyes scanned the terrain for subtle signs, a patch of darker vegetation, the faint trail of a desert animal, that Kalen would have overlooked. She directed him to a hidden spring he never would have found on his own, and later, used a makeshift snare to catch a desert rabbit for their first meal in days. Her knowledge, a consequence of her life as an outlaw, was now the only thing keeping them both alive, and Kalen found his grudging respect for her growing with every passing moment. They rode until their horses were on the verge of collapse, their desperation a physical ache in their bones. Just as Kalen felt the last dregs of his strength giving out, they saw it, a small, dilapidated homestead, its roof sagging, its windows empty black eyes. It was a ghost from a past life, a flicker of civilization in an otherwise unforgiving landscape. They dismounted and stumbled inside, the cool, dusty air a welcome relief. The homestead was a wreck, but it offered shelter. As Elara collapsed onto a rotting mattress, Kalen's gaze fell on a small, wooden box tucked away in a corner. He opened it, revealing a few old letters and a stack of faded photographs. His heart pounded in his chest as he picked up the top one. It was a photograph of a group of men, all young and carefree. He recognized a younger version of Blackwood, Elara's father, and one of his brothers. But next to them, his smile as bright as the day Kalen remembered, was his own brother, Ethan. Kalen's hand trembled, the photograph crinkling under his grip. His brother hadn't been an innocent victim. He had been with them. A member of the Blackwood gang. The truth of his brother's murder had been a lie, all along. The photograph, faded and fragile, trembled in Kalen's hand. The face of his younger brother, Ethan, stared back at him, his smile a ghost from a past that was now a complete fabrication. He wasn't a righteous victim of a mining dispute, he was a willing companion to the very outlaws Kalen had spent years hunting. The realization hit Kalen like a physical blow, stealing the air from his lungs. The life he had built, the unwavering pursuit of justice that had defined his very existence, was built on a lie. The grief and purpose that had driven him across countless miles were suddenly meaningless, replaced by a cold, numbing emptiness. He felt the weight of every sacrifice, every sleepless night, every grim decision, and they all amounted to nothing. He dropped the photograph back into the box, his hands shaking, and sat heavily on a crate. The splintered wood a fitting seat for a man whose world had just been shattered. Ilara, who had been watching him from the corner, saw the profound change in his demeanor. Her own defiance had been a constant wall, but in that moment, seeing his mask of strength crumble, she felt a shift. She limped over and sat beside him, her gaze falling on the open box. "You found it," she said softly, her voice devoid of its usual sharpness. Kalen looked at her, the accusation burning in his eyes. He pulled the photograph out again and pointed to her father, then to his brother. "They were friends," she confirmed, a painful honesty in her voice. "My father, and a few others, they weren't always outlaws. Not like they are now. They were prospectors. A brotherhood. And your brother, he rode with them for a time." The quiet revelation was devastating. Ilara explained that the group had planned to strike it rich together, a wild dream that had ended in bitter betrayal and the splintering of their friendship. The men Kalen had always considered villains were not just criminals, they were ghosts of his brother's past, men who had once shared a hopeful, ambitious dream. Before Kalen could fully process the bombshell, a new sound cut through the homestead's dust-filled stillness. The steady thud of a horse's hooves, growing closer, resonated from outside. Both Kalen and Ilara froze, their brief moment of shared vulnerability replaced by a stark, renewed sense of danger. The hoofbeats stopped. The creak of a saddle. A shadow fell across the open doorway. A figure, tall and grizzled, stood in the frame, silhouetted by the setting sun. He was a veteran member of the Blackwood gang, his face lined with years of hard living, his eyes like chipped flint. He scanned the room, his gaze settling on Ilara. A flash of relief crossed his features, quickly followed by a cold, hostile glare as he looked at the wounded lawman standing next to her. The gang member, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol, recognized Ilara immediately. But in his eyes, Kalen was just another man, a wounded lawman, an enemy who was now sharing a space with their leader's daughter. "Well, look what the wind blew in," the man said, his voice a low, gravelly threat. "Looks like you made yourself a new friend, Ilara. One who's about to be very sorry he ever came looking for us." The old outlaw, Silas, took a slow, deliberate step into the homestead's dim light, his eyes moving from Kalen's hand on his pistol to Ilara's face, etched with fear and a hint of defiance. The air was thick with the dust of the old house and the unspoken threat that hung between them. "You think you know him, Sheriff?" Silas sneered, his voice a dry rasp. "You think you know what he was? He wasn't some kind-hearted fool who got caught in the crossfire. He was a piece of this whole damn mess." He looked at the photograph Kalen still held in his hand. "That right there," he gestured with a flick of his chin, "that's a snapshot of a dream. A dream that turned into a nightmare." Silas began to speak, his voice a low, gravelly drone, revealing a history Kalen was completely unprepared for. He spoke of how Ethan had not just been an innocent associate of the gang, but a full-fledged partner, riding with them in a high-stakes plan to seize a gold shipment. The story of his brother's innocence, the very foundation of Kalen's life, crumbled with every word Silas uttered. Silas's gaze bore into Kalen's, a flicker of dark amusement in his tired eyes. He explained that a deep rift had formed within their group, an argument over how to divide the spoils of their last big score. "It was all about the gold, son," he said, his voice laced with a bitter resentment. "That's what always comes between men. Greed. Your brother, he wasn't as clean as you think he was. He was just as eager for that fortune as the rest of us." Silas painted a grim picture of a vicious double-cross, a betrayal so deep it had turned friends into mortal enemies and set the Blackwood gang on the path to lawlessness. He hinted at a specific sum of gold, now hidden, and a final, fatal confrontation that had nothing to do with a simple mining dispute. Ethan, Silas claimed, had been caught in the middle, and his death was a consequence of his own actions, not a random act of violence. The words cut deeper than any bullet, a truth so painful Kalen felt the foundations of his world shift beneath his feet. Just as Kalen was about to demand more information, to piece together this shattered reality, Silas's eyes fluttered. He leaned against the doorframe, a ragged cough escaping his lips. A dark stain, fresh and wet, began to seep through the front of his shirt. He'd been shot. The veteran outlaw had been bleeding out for some time, his confrontation with them a final, desperate act. He looked at Alara, a sudden, desperate urgency in his eyes. "The truth, it ain't in that picture," he gasped, his voice weakening. "It's with her. Your mother, she wrote it all down. Every lie, every betrayal, she hid it." He pointed a shaking finger at Alara, his words a final, frantic whisper. "The journal. Find the journal." With that, his eyes rolled back in his head, and he collapsed to the dusty floor, leaving Kalen and Alara alone with a dead man, a photograph, and a new, crucial piece of a very old puzzle. The silence in the homestead was now absolute, broken only by the low hum of flies and the soft shifting of dust. Silas lay motionless on the floor, his secret having escaped with his last breath. Kalen stood over the body, the weight of his new knowledge a crushing burden. He wasn't just chasing an outlaw gang anymore. He was a man in pursuit of a ghost, the truth of a past that had been buried under years of lies. Alara, her face a mixture of grief and resolve, looked at him. "We have to go," she whispered. "My father's men will come looking for Silas, and they'll find us. We can't let them find this." She gestured to the open box and the photograph. The urgency in her voice was a chilling reminder of their precarious position. Kalen agreed. They were no longer running from the law, they were running toward the truth, a far more dangerous chase. With no time to lose, they rode away from the homestead, putting distance between themselves and the dead man, their minds racing with Silas's dying words. They traveled for 2 days, seeking refuge in a remote, long-forgotten box canyon that was accessible only through a treacherous, winding trail. It was a place of secrets, a forgotten corner of the world where they could finally take a breath. As they tended to their wounds and rationed their remaining supplies, their focus turned to the journal. Alara remembered her mother speaking of a journal, in hushed tones, a secret she had to protect. She was a smart woman, Alara said, her voice filled with a painful nostalgia. She always said the truth was the only thing that could set a person free. She must have known something was coming. Her mother had often hidden small trinkets and important papers in the places where the gang sought shelter. The most likely place for a sensitive document would be in her father's old hideouts, the places of their history. The memory clicked into place, and Alara guided Kalen to a small, isolated cabin that her father had used in the early days of his prospecting, before the gang was even a real gang. The cabin was a ghost of a life that never was. The air was stale, and a thin layer of dust coated everything. Kalen and Alara began a meticulous search, turning over crates, checking behind loose floorboards, and feeling for any hidden compartments. The hunt was tense, a race against an unknown clock. They were looking for something that might not even exist, a last, desperate plea from a woman who wanted to expose a truth that had been lost for years. Finally, Alara's hand brushed against a loose stone in the fireplace's hearth. She pulled it away, revealing a small, hidden alcove. Inside, wrapped in a brittle oilcloth, was a leather-bound book, its cover worn with age. They had found it. With trembling hands, Kalen unwrapped the cloth and opened the journal. The first entry was not a plea for peace or a confession, but a simple, damning set of words that confirmed the truth and pointed them to a final destination. He came to Iron Creek to make a choice. It was him and the gold against the rest of them. And that night, everything changed. The words hung in the air, a final, direct line to the place where all of Kalen's pain began, promising a revelation that would change everything. The journey back to Iron Creek was a pilgrimage into Kalen's most painful memory. The landscape, once a place of brutal grief, was now infused with a new, unsettling energy. Every bend in the river, every weathered rock formation, brought a flood of conflicting emotions. This was the place where he had said goodbye to his brother, where his sense of justice had been forged in a crucible of loss and anger. He had always seen it as a site of pure tragedy, but with the journal in his hand, its pages filled with his brother's secret life, Iron Creek felt like a stage, its scenery hiding a complex and deadly drama. He was no longer just the grieving brother. He was an investigator, searching for a truth that had been hidden in plain sight. Ilara rode beside him, her silence a profound sign of respect for his personal pilgrimage. Her own life was unraveling with every turn of the journal's pages, but in this moment, she seemed to understand that his pain was a ghost he needed to finally lay to rest. Following the clues in Ilara's mother's journal, they moved away from the main road and deeper into the wilderness surrounding the creek. The entries spoke of a hidden spot, a place where a final betrayal had been planned. The journey became a tense search for a specific landmark, a unique rock formation described in detail in the brittle pages. Kalen's mind was a maelstrom of conflicting thoughts. He remembered his brother as a good man, a dreamer with a kind heart. The person described in the journal was a different man, a reckless youth, driven by ambition and greed. He was desperate to find a truth that would reconcile the two, but with every step he took, the chasm between them seemed to grow wider. Ilara, her eyes sharp and knowing, pointed to a cluster of juniper trees nestled between two large boulders. "It's here," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "This is where the gang's final meeting was." They dismounted and began a careful search of the area. They found old, discarded supplies and spent ammunition casings, the remnants of a long-ago meeting. It was a tangible link to the past. Kalen's gaze fell on a small, loose pile of stones beneath one of the boulders, an unnatural mound of earth that looked like it had been recently disturbed. He knelt and began to move the stones aside, his heart pounding in his chest. What he found was not a body, but a makeshift grave, hastily dug and filled in. It wasn't his brother's grave. It was another man's. And next to the grave, half buried in the dirt, was a small, ornate silver locket, its surface dulled by time and the elements. Kalen picked it up, and a wave of cold realization washed over him as Ilara, her eyes wide with shock, recognized it instantly. "I know this locket," she whispered, her voice trembling. "My mother wrote about it. It belonged to the man who rode with my father that night. The man who was with Ethan when he died." The small silver locket felt heavy in Kalen's hand, its cold metal a stark contrast to the burning truth it held. Ilara, her voice a low, disbelieving whisper, spoke the name of its owner, Samuel Vance. He was a man she only knew from hushed conversations and old photographs, a member of her father's original crew who had vanished long ago. Her mother's journal had only ever referred to him as the ghost. Ilara's face, a mask of shock, reflected her dawning realization. Her mother had not written a story about a missing friend, but a carefully coded account of a murder. The locket was more than a piece of jewelry. It was a testament, a final, damning piece of evidence that had been buried with the truth for years. Kalen looked from the locket to Ilara's face, and in her eyes, he saw the final puzzle piece click into place. The innocence they had both clung to, his brother's, her father's, was a lie. Ilara opened the journal to the last hidden entry, her hands shaking as she read. Her mother's careful script detailed the final, tragic night. Ethan and Samuel had plotted to steal the gold from the rest of the gang, believing they could disappear and start a new life. But Ilara's father, Blackwood, had discovered their betrayal. A confrontation ensued, not a gunfight, but a brutal hand-to-hand struggle. In a moment of desperation, it was Samuel Vance who killed Ethan, not in a duel, but by running him down and leaving him for dead. Alara's father, faced with the choice of exposing the truth and turning in his friend or protecting his crew, had chosen loyalty. He covered up the murder, buried Samuel Vance to make it look like he simply disappeared, and created a false story about a fair fight. The man who had been convicted for Ethan's death was a low-level outlaw who had been in the wrong place at the wrong time, an easy scapegoat for a sheriff who wanted a clean answer. The entire foundation of Caelan's life, his relentless pursuit of justice, had been based on a lie. His brother wasn't a saintly victim. He was a thief. And the man he had believed to be the killer was simply a pawn in a far more brutal game. Just as the last words of the journal faded into the silence, Caelan heard a sound that sent a cold shiver down his spine. Not a single footstep, but the low, synchronized creak of saddles and the deliberate, rhythmic thud of hooves on dirt. A sound that spoke of many men. He looked up, his hand moving to the butt of his pistol, his eyes sweeping the perimeter. They were surrounded. The entire Blackwood gang, led by Alara's father, had tracked them to this very spot, their grim faces illuminated by the setting sun. They weren't there for a friendly reunion. They were there for the journal, for the proof of a betrayal that could tear their family apart. Caelan and Alara were now standing on the very ground where a man had been killed and the truth had been buried. And the men who were responsible for it had finally arrived to claim what was theirs. The sun dipped below the horizon, bathing the canyon in a final, bloody red light. In the center of the clearing, surrounded by the grim, weathered faces of the Blackwood gang, Caelan and Alara stood alone. The gang's leader, Alara's father, sat atop his horse, his face a mask of stone. He was a man carved from the same hard earth as his crew, his eyes holding a profound mixture of authority and pain. He looked at Caelan, his gaze full of the silent accusation of a man whose prisoner had become an unexpected ally. Then, his eyes fell on Alara, and the mask cracked. "Alara," he said, his voice a low, paternal rumble that was chilling in its sincerity. "You know you don't belong here. Give me the book. Come home." The demand was not a threat, but a plea. He wanted to bury the truth again, to return to the simple, brutal order of his life. But Alara's grip on the journal was firm, a testament to her newfound resolve. She had found a different kind of purpose, and she would not let it go. In that moment, Alara stepped forward, away from Caelan's side and into the space between the sheriff and her father's gang. She held the journal up, a small, fragile book that now contained a lifetime of betrayal. "Tell them, Pa," she cried, her voice ringing with the raw emotion of a daughter betrayed. "Tell them what really happened to Samuel Vance. Tell them you lied. Tell them why Ethan Stone had to die." The words hung in the air, a series of accusations that fell like bombshells among the crew. Faces that had been cold and impassive now showed confusion, then anger. The name Samuel Vance was a ghost they had buried long ago, and Alara's father had just ordered his daughter to face justice for a crime they believed they had gotten away with. A tall, gaunt outlaw known as Tombstone lowered his rifle, his gaze fixed on the gang leader. "What is she talkin' about, Pa? The man who killed Ethan Stone is sittin' in a jail cell in Redemption Gulch." The leader's face hardened, his earlier plea gone, replaced by the grim authority of a man protecting his lie. "It's a trick. The lawman filled her head with lies. He's using her to tear us apart." The words were a desperate attempt to regain control, but it was too late. The seeds of doubt had been planted. A few of the younger gang members, the ones who had not been part of the original crew, looked at Alara, then at their leader, their loyalty fractured by her powerful words. A low murmur rippled through the group. The family was breaking. As Alara's father raised his pistol, a silent command for his men to move in, a sudden, blinding flash of a rifle shot erupted from the ranks of his own crew. Not aimed at Alara, but at the ground between Caelan and her. "He's right," a voice cried out from the back of the group. "He's a liar. He left us all to die for a piece of gold." The shot was followed by another, and then another. The gang, once a cohesive, ruthless unit, had devolved into a chaotic maelstrom of gunfire and betrayal, turning on itself in a desperate, bloody civil war. Would you like me to continue with the part 2? where Kalen and Alara find themselves caught in the middle of a gunfight between the divided gang. Subscribe, comment, like and share. Please on your notification bell for the next part.